The secret tribunal. The arrest phase was over. 8 men, all trained by the German Abwehr, now sat in separate cells inside the Department of Justice building in Washington, D.C., the doors locked behind them with the kind of finality that doesn't need a verdict. Outside, the public knew little. News bulletins hinted at captured spies, but the details were smothered beneath wartime censorship. Inside the White House, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's patience had already worn thin. He wanted blood, not bureaucracy. On July 2, 1942, Attorney General Francis Biddle and JEdgarHoover met in the Oval Office. The conversation cut straight to the point. Biddle outlined legal options, civilian trial or military court-martial. Roosevelt interrupted. These men didn't come here for fair play. They came to kill a play. They came to kill a... They'll get a trial, but it won't be the kind that drags on for months. Biddle hesitated. The Constitution guaranteed civilian trials when courts were open. The United States wasn't under martial law. But Roosevelt's mind was set. We'll use a military tribunal, he said. I won't hand him to any judge armed with a writ of habeas corpus. That line ended discussion. The order was final. A military commission was assembled within days, the first since Lincoln's assassination conspirators in 1865. 7 military officers were sworn in as judges. The Attorney General himself would act as prosecutor, while Colonel Kenneth Royal and Major Lawson Stone were assigned to defend the Germans. It was a strange scene. Lawyers in crisp uniforms preparing to argue cases that might already be decided. The courtroom wasn't a grand chamber filled with reporters and a curious public. It was a hastily converted room inside the Justice Department building, draped in flags and sealed from view. Guards stood at every door. No press, no recordings, no transcripts for public eyes. When the Germans entered, their posture told the story, indifference masking fear. George Dasch looked exhausted. His defection had bought him nothing. He sat shackled beside men he had betrayed to spare American lives. Across from them, Biddle laid out the charges: conspiracy to commit sabotage, violation of the law of war, and unlawful entry into the United States with intent to destroy national defense materials. The words sounded mechanical, but everyone in the room understood what they meant. Death sentences waiting for signatures. The trial it moved with a velocity unheard of in civilian court. Witness lists were shortened, evidence summarized, arguments clipped. The tribunal session stretched 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. The accused sat behind defense tables, stoic or resigned. Dasch at times leaned forward, insisting on speaking directly to his interrogators, eager to recount how he personally had turned himself in to prevent catastrophe. The judges listened politely, made notes, then switched to the next testimony. Major Royal's defense strategy hung on a desperate threat. The men hadn't committed any act of war. They entered the country unarmed in the sense that no destruction occurred. He argued they were, at worst, would be criminals deserving of civilian due process. In civilian court, execution before conviction would be unthinkable. But the administration's stance was direct. Intention was enough. The conspirators didn't have to succeed to be guilty of waging war. Behind closed doors, Biddle privately admitted his discomfort. He found himself cornered between law and presidential will. Roosevelt refused all suggestions of moderation. In a note sent during deliberations, he wrote, "Surely they are as guilty as it is possible to be. The death penalty is almost obligatory." In another message to Biddle, he was even clearer. "I don't care what their technical defense is. They're enemy saboteurs. Execute them." Meanwhile, Hoover's FBI team hovered in the background, quietly consolidating the narrative for future press releases. To the Bureau, the trial wasn't about justice, it was about reputation. Hoover ensured his reports excluded any mention of Dasch's voluntary confession. The FBI's official statement would later claim its own brilliance had uncovered the entire plot through superior investigation. Inside the tribunal, that distortion subtly shifted tone. Dasch's cooperation became less heroic, his guilt more convenient. The proceedings blurred under fluorescent lights. Witnesses testified about money found in safe deposit boxes, explosives recovered at Amagansett and Ponte Vedra, and confessions taken from the Saboteurs. Every piece lined up with Dasch's original report, but instead of exonerating him, it bound him tighter to the group. The prosecution painted him as their leader, the brain behind the mission, implying his confession came only after failure. Royal objected repeatedly, arguing that punishing the informant undermined everything America claimed to stand for. The judges deliberated, privately stone-faced. Reporters smelled something unusual. Rumors circulated about a closed-door spy trial happening in Washington. A few details reached newspapers, but the Office of Censorship restricted publication. Roosevelt wanted control over every sentence printed. The American public would learn that the FBI captured Nazi saboteurs through brilliant detection. No mention of confession, no hint of leniency. For the accused, time dissolved. Each morning they were marched into the courtroom, each evening back to isolation cells. Their hair was cropped, their uniforms replaced by identical gray clothing. Guards stood with bayonets fixed. In rare pauses, they whispered in German, some blaming Dasch for betrayal, others resigned to the outcome. One of them, Edward Curling, muttered to a guard through bars, "He did not save himself. He only killed us faster." He wrote letters pleading that his voluntary surrender was proof of conscience, not cunning. He told his lawyer he'd expected protection, even gratitude for stopping an attack. Instead, he'd been turned into an accomplice. Royal promised an appeal, but the chain of command was airtight. Roosevelt's order ensured nothing could stop the verdict once reached. Throughout late July, the tribunal's secrecy became self-defeating. Without press scrutiny, mistakes and contradictions went unexamined. Translators sometimes misphrased testimony. Defendants' statements were paraphrased rather than recorded verbatim. Yet the process continued, fast, efficient, and terminal. Every evening, Biddle summarized progress in memos to Roosevelt. The president's replies grew shorter. "Proceed at once," he wrote. By July 27, closing arguments began. Biddle emphasized deterrence. The saboteurs represented a wartime threat so grave that mercy would invite repetition. Royal countered with constitutional precedent, citing Ex parte Milligan, the Civil War case forbidding military tribunals when civilian courts function. But Roosevelt's administration saw this as a different category: foreign agents, not citizens. The judges retired to deliberate, already knowing their conclusion. 2 days later, verdicts were read aloud in the sealed courtroom. Guilty on all charges, all 8 sentenced to die by electric chair. Only President Roosevelt himself could alter the outcome. In the hours after sentencing, Biddle carried the summary to the White House for final approval. He and Roosevelt sat together in the study. "Two of them helped you," Biddle said cautiously. Dasch and Berger, they came forward voluntarily. Roosevelt exhaled, eyes fixed on the paper. "Then commute them," he said after a pause. "The others die." With a stroke of his pen, 6 men were condemned and 2 spared, though spared meant 30 years in a military prison. The official announcement would come later, adapted for public calm. The language would speak of justice served and enemies punished. No mention of secrecy or the moral maze behind it. For the survivors, the disdain or the moral maze behind it. For the survivors, the disdain. Dasch realized in that instant that his betrayal had bought America security, but not himself freedom. July hummed with summer heat as the tribunal doors finally opened. Guards filed the prisoners out under military escort. In less than 6 weeks, an entire Nazi sabotage network had risen, collapsed, and been judged inside a single building few would ever know held a court. The nation believed it had witnessed swift justice. Inside those silent rooms, law had bent quietly to war. The judgment and the executions. The verdicts were signed, sealed, and hidden. Behind fortified doors in Washington, D.C., 8 men awaited word of a fate already written. The press was barred, transcripts classified, and the American public told only that justice had been swift. In truth, the final decisions came down to a handful of signatures and a sense of political timing duality. Roosevelt's order for execution had been issued on July 31st. The sentence would be carried out within 5 days. At Fort Meade, Maryland, military guards read the formal execution notices aloud through steel bars. The 6 condemned men, Herbert Haupt, Heinrich Hank, Edward Curling, Werner Thiel, Herman Neubauer, and Richard Quirin, stood in silence. Some gave nods of resignation, others clung to defiance. Haupt, the youngest, only 22, asked quietly if his parents in Chicago would be told before or after. No one answered. George John Dasch and Ernest Berger were escorted separately. Both had received last-minute clemency orders commuting their deaths to imprisonment. The guards didn't explain why. Dasch already knew Roosevelt's motive wasn't mercy, it was convenience. The president had to show that cooperation brought difference, not command. As Dasch was led away, he caught a final glimpse of Curling staring through the bars, lips thin, eyes hollow. They didn't speak. The execution site was a nondescript building inside the D.C. district. Jail complex. Windows were blacked out. The public knew nothing of the scheduling. Even most prison staff were uninformed until hours before. Shortly after dawn on August 8, 1942, military police lined the perimeter. Witnesses included Attorney General Biddle, several military officers, and a physician tasked with confirming deaths. At 7 a.m., the first man was brought in, Richard Quirin. His expression was blank, his steps measured. Chaplains stood nearby, offering prayers in German. He refused them. The process was methodical. Strap, hood, switch. By 7:10, the current surged. 15 minutes later, the body was removed and the next condemned brought in. One after another, the cycle repeated. Thiel, Curling, Neubauer, Heinck, Haupt. Each name erased Irristen, each name erased Quirin. Each name erased me. When it ended, 6 bodies lay covered in white sheets in the prison morgue. The smell of ozone lingered in the air. Outside, the streets remained ordinary. Commuters caught trolleys, children walked to summer parks. No announcements interrupted the radio. In a war about to engulf the globe, America's government had just executed 6 enemy agents without trial by jury, and almost no citizen knew the details. JEdgarHoover moved fast to define the story before questions could form. The FBI's official statement, issued within hours, presented the executions as the triumph of American vigilance. Headlines credited the Bureau's unprecedented sleuthing for foiling the Germans' plan before the first bomb could fall. Nowhere did they mention a defection, a confession, or the inner conflict of a man who'd surrendered his comrades to prevent Disgusted to prevent Disgusted, to prevent Disgusted to prevent Disgusted. Dasch and Berger's cooperation was classified confidential evidence. It vanished from the narrative. For Roosevelt, the secrecy served multiple purposes. It showcased decisive leadership without risking public debate. By acting through a military tribunal rather than civilian courts, he reinforced executive authority during war. Yet even within his administration, murmurs of discomfort persisted. Biddle, though outwardly composed, later wrote in his diary, "I did not doubt their guilt, but I feared the precedent." That fear proved well-founded. The executions created a new kind of silence in Washington, one lined with legal unease. In civilian law, appeals could suspend death sentences for months. Here, there were none. Habeas corpus petitions were quietly denied, citing wartime necessity. The written opinions justifying these measures would not be released to the public until the following year, after every condemned man was in the ground. By then, outrage had faded, only precedent remained. Ex parte Quirin would define the reach of military power during wartime for decades to come. Meanwhile, the human story dissolved into classified paperwork. The families of the executed received brief formal notices sent through intermediary formal notices sent through intermediary round. No remains were released. The 6 bodies were buried in anonymous graves inside a federal cemetery in Washington, marked only by numerical codes. There were no funerals, no flags, no mention in newspapers beyond the government press releases. In Germany, their deaths were barely acknowledged. The Nazi regime, embarrassed by the failure, stripped their names from propaganda lists. Dasch and Berger were moved from isolation to federal prison at Leavenworth, Kansas. They woke each day to newspaper clippings celebrating their capture, stories that reduced their confessions to minor footnotes. Dasch wrote obsessively to the Justice Department, begging recognition. "I risked my life to stop them," he told one official, "and for that I am buried alive." His letters reflected a man trapped between heroism and guilt, a defector condemned by both nations he tried to serve. Inside the FBI, Hoover's staff compiled a special edition of internal reports bound in red leather. The title, Sabotage on U.S. Soil, Case Closed. It praised the Bureau's investigative efficiency and highlighted Hoover's strategic coordination as key to success. A marginal note from a staff attorney gave away the truth in private shorthand. Info derived from Dasch confession. That line never appeared in any public document. The press continued to celebrate the case as a decisive win in America's invisible war. The New York Times praised the speed and firmness with which the government acted. None of those reporters knew the tribunal's secrecy had hidden the uncertainty of guilt for one of the executed men, nor that the so-called trial had operated without civilian oversight. Roosevelt's swift justice had become Hoover's greatest publicity, but for those who sat in that sealed courtroom, the sense of victory was muted. Army lawyer Kenneth Royal, who had argued for due process, received quiet commendation and then orders to strike die. Years later, he would tell colleagues the tribunal had been expedient, not exemplary. The phrase captured what no public verdict could: justice, sacrifice, and necessity. By the end of 1942, Operation Pastorius had receded into wartime myth. School papers retold it as a patriotic fable, America alert, the enemy thwarted. Few realized that beneath the myth lay a narrower truth, a government so driven to prove strength it had crushed nuance under secrecy. One final detail summed up that contradiction. On the day the executions took place, Roosevelt attended a Navy ceremony honoring shipyard workers for boosting production. When a correspondent asked if he planned to comment on the spy case, he smiled faintly and said, "It's handled." That was the only public acknowledgement he ever made. In the dark quiet of their prison cells, Dasch and Berger listened to radio news that praised the FBI, rarely daring to mention the men who had caused it all to unravel. The sound of static filled the silence between reports. For them, the war of loyalty was over, but the sentence of erasure had just begun. Legal fallout, ex parte Quirin. By mid-August 1942, Washington's war machine had moved on. The 6 condemned saboteurs were buried without names, the remaining 2 locked away behind concrete walls. On paper, the case was closed. In reality, the legal aftershocks had just begun. Inside the Supreme Court, a quiet storm was forming. Chief Justice Harlan Fiske Stone sat surrounded by urgent files marked ex parte Quirin, the official appeal of the Nazi saboteurs. The ink was barely dry on their death warrants when attorneys for Dasch and Berger filed a petition for habeas corpus, demanding review of the tribunal's authority. The court had never confronted a question quite like it. Could a president acting as commander-in-chief override the judicial system to execute men on American soil while civilian courts were open? A ruling for the government would grant the executive near-limitless wartime power. A ruling against it could brand Roosevelt's tribunal unconstitutional and politically ruinous. The justices convened on July 29th in emergency session, an extraordinary measure. No public schedule, no reporters. The corridors of the Supreme Court stayed dim that night as clerks prepared transcripts ferried from the Justice Department, still warm from typewriter ribbons. Colonel Kenneth Royal argued for the defense. He stood before the bench, voice steady despite exhaustion, and repeated the same principle that had guided his closing argument weeks earlier. The Constitution does not permit this. He cited ex parte Milligan, reminding the court that even during the Civil War, when rebellion raged across the country, citizens could not be tried by military commission while civilian courts remained open. What had changed, he asked, between then and now? Solicitor General Charles Fahey responded for the government. His tone was technical, confident, meticulous. The saboteurs, he said, were unlawful combatants, men who entered the country intending to wage war in violation of international convention. They forfeited civilian protections the moment they stepped ashore. This, he insisted, was not about rights, but about wartime logic. Allowing them access to civil courts would cripple national defense. The president, he concluded, has authority to act against those who violate the laws of war, wherever they may be found. The argument lasted almost 14 hours over 2 nights. The atmosphere was tense, the chamber thick with cigarette smoke and fatigue. Observers, limited to legal clerks and a handful of military officers, noted the justices' visible discomfort. Some whispered the court was afraid not of the saboteurs, but of the precedent waiting behind them. Outside, Washington streets sweltered in August heat, unaware that the balance between liberty and authority was being redrawn upstairs. Justice Felix Frankfurter, usually cautious, became the pivotal voice. "We are a nation at war," he told colleagues privately. "If the president cannot act against armed agents here, we endanger as a danger." Stone agreed, but worried aloud about judicial integrity. "If we defer entirely," he said, "we may not recognize our own Constitution when peace returns." By dawn, a fragile consensus formed. The tribunal would stand lawful under the Constitution's War Powers Clause. but they would delay releasing details until later, sparing the public from doubt while executions proceeded. 2 days later, on August 8, as the electric chair sparked to life in the district jail, the Supreme Court delivered a one-page order upholding the military tribunal's authority. The justices promised to publish their full reasoning in due course. By the time the opinion appeared in early October, 6 men were long dead. Most readers never noticed the delay. Ex parte Quirin became official precedent. Terse, clinical, and profoundly errant and punching elect. The justices promised the public tersitil. A Quirin became official precedent. Terse, clinical, and profoundly pain in pub. It held that unlawful combatants, spies, saboteurs, or infiltrators out of uniform could lawfully be tried by military commission even when civilian courts operated nearby. The decision drew an invisible line separating those entitled to the Constitution's full shield from those who were not. The tribunal was declared constitutional retroactively, transforming Roosevelt's directive from questionable command into legitimate law. But even within the court, the victory felt tainted. Several justices later confessed unease. Frankfurter drafted a private memorandum describing the case as an adventure in emergency jurisprudence. Stone himself admitted that timing had forced their hands. It was war, he told a clerk. We could not paralyze the government by debate. The memorandum remained sealed for decades. For Attorney General Biddle, the decision brought no satisfaction. He described the experience as both necessary and terrible, yet its ripple effects were immediate. The Department of War began codifying procedures for future military commissions, citing Quirin as the foundational doctrine. Within a year, new manuals on the trial of unlawful combatants circulated to the Pentagon. The precedent had been institutionalized before historians could even weigh its meaning. In the press, Hoover framed the ruling as validation. FBI bulletins celebrated the unity of command that had allowed the Bureau and the military to remove threats swiftly. Headlines praised Roosevelt for demonstrating that justice and strength could coexist. What those headlines didn't reveal was that Supreme Court justices had ruled under enormous political pressure, their opinions shaped as much by urgency as by principle. The public learned only fragments that 6 German saboteurs had died and 2 lived by the president's gracious decision. The fine distinctions between civil and military authority never reached newspaper pages. To most Americans, it was a question already answered. Traitors punished, peace preserved. But in legal circles, dissent brewed quietly. Scholars warned that Quirin blurred definitions that had anchored American justice since the Republic's founding. Who decides when a person stops being a civilian? What prevents the government from labeling its own citizens unlawful combatants during national emergencies? Those questions went largely unanswered in 1942. They would reappear 60 years later, in a different century, under a different threat. When the attacks of September 11, 2001 struck American cities, lawyers inside the Bush administration reopened old precedent files. Near the top sat ex parte Quirin. The decision became the blueprint for the creation of military commissions at Guantanamo Bay, the justification for indefinite detention, and the phrase unlawful combatant reappeared in legal vocabulary as if waiting to be revived. Every hearing, every debate about executive detention and due process for terrorism, suspects traced its parentage back to that sealed courtroom in 1942. Looking back, historians often call Quirin the hinge moment when American wartime justice permanently diverged from peacetime rule. Its defenders claim it kept the country safe during total war. Critics argue it traded legal certainty for expedience. Both views contain truth. What's undeniable is the shadow it cast, one that stretched from a secret tribunal in Washington to detention camps half a world away. In the months after the ruling, Roosevelt rarely spoke of the case again. Public attention shifted to Guadalcanal, North Africa, the next phase of global war. But for the men who had watched the tribunal unfold, the sense of precedent hung heavy. Colonel Royal, who had argued furiously for civilian process, kept a personal copy of the Supreme Court opinion among his papers, annotated with a single note in the margin. If this stands in peace as it did in war, we have changed more than we know. When the nation celebrated victory in 1945, most Americans remembered the spies as faceless enemies, forgotten amid triumph. Yet buried underneath the wartime icons was a quiet truth. Operation Pastorius had failed militarily, but it had succeeded in reshaping the boundaries of American law. The Constitution had weathered sabotage, not through explosions, but through decisions made in silence. From that silence, a precedent survived. In every courtroom where security and liberty collide, in every debate over military justice that follows acts of terror, the echo is echo. The echo is a echo. It is a lentus. A question whispered first in 1942 remains unanswered. How far can a democracy bend its rules before it becomes something else entirely? The Propaganda War. When the last reports of the Saboteurs' executions reached Berlin, the Abwehr's leadership fell into silence. The failure was so complete, so humiliating, that even the Nazi propaganda ministry refused to claim the men as martyrs. Operation Pastorius had been designed to terrify America, to prove the Reich could strike its homeland. Instead, it had achieved the opposite, a showcase for American vigilance. The terror campaign meant to unnerve the public became a propaganda gift to Washington, and JEdgarHoover knew exactly how to use it. In the weeks following the executions, Hoover's FBI launched a carefully managed public relations offensive. Every newspaper and radio bulletin told the same story. 8 Nazi saboteurs had landed in secret, but America's intelligence machine had crushed them before they could act. The version of events released to the press was surgical. No mention of George Dasch's voluntary confession, no debate about the legality of the secret tribunal. The Bureau framed the arrest as a result of impeccable investigative work and unwavering coordination between agencies. It was Hoover's masterpiece, a narrative of absolute control in a time of chaos. 2 days after the executions, Hoover staged a quiet press conference inside the Department of Justice. Only trusted reporters were invited, all of whom had been briefed in advance on what to print and, more importantly, what to omit. Behind him hung an enlarged map of the United States dotted with red pins marking intercepted targets. He stood before it like a general who had just vanquished an invisible army. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, he declared, has prevented the enemy from piercing America's armor. The phrase echoed across headlines the next morning. The reality was murkier. Inside the Bureau, a few senior agents who had interviewed Dasch understood that his defection, not clever fieldwork, had saved them from disaster. But publicly admitting that would mean acknowledging that the Bureau's intelligence net hadn't detected the infiltration at all. For Hoover, whose career thrived on the myth of omniscience, that truth was intolerable. He struck Dasch's name from public narratives, forbade mention of any defection in briefings, and rewrote the case logs for release to the press. The saboteurs, as far as the public record was concerned, had been captured through excellent investigation and immediate action. In propaganda terms, the FBI's triumph was masterfully timed. America's wartime morale in 1942 was fragile, Pearl Harbor was still fresh, and the Pacific Campaign had barely begun to turn. The discovery of Nazi infiltrators could have deepened the sense of vulnerability. Instead, Hoover transformed it into evidence of strength. Newspapers ran bold headlines, FBI foils Nazi plot, while patriotic pamphlets framed the episode as proof that internal vigilance would protect the nation. It was reassurance carefully wrapped in fear. The enemy is near, but the FBI is nearer. Radio commentators picked up the message and broadcast dramatized reconstructions. Listeners heard actors voicing brave agents confronting ruthless Nazis. The tone was heroic and comforting. Meanwhile, wartime newsreels showed Hoover in profile, pen in hand, as captions praised the guardians of democracy. The saboteurs themselves were nameless, faceless villains, an anonymous menace already dispatched. Public anxiety melted into pride. But beneath that confidence, suspicion took root. Every German accent, every European surname felt newly dangerous. The Justice Department received surges of letters reporting supposed foreign sympathizers, most of them innocent immigrants. Propaganda had succeeded twice, once in strengthening trust in government, and again in reviving the fear that justified its power. For President Roosevelt, the spin achieved what subtle diplomacy might not have. It unified a jittery population around a belief in internal security. He privately praised Hoover for swift action and effective publicity. The FBI director accepted the compliment with calculated modesty, then expanded his domestic network even further. The Bureau used the Pastorius case to argue for broader surveillance authority over Germany's American-born citizens, citing ongoing infiltration risk. Congress approved increased funding without debate, In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels studied American coverage through intercepted news summaries. Furious, he complained in his diaries that Washington had turned a clear example of Abwehr bravery into a tale of Yankee efficiency. He briefly considered launching counter-propaganda to portray the executed agents as heroes, but even Hitler dismissed it. "Failure breeds no martyrs," he said. Within weeks, Operation Pastorius disappeared from German broadcasts altogether. The regime simply erased it. Behind the scenes, Hoover's public relations department compiled an internal memorandum outlining how to maintain public engagement. It emphasized three objectives: strengthen faith in the FBI, suppress details of internal dissent, and frame the saboteurs' deaths as deterrence rather than vengeance. Photographs of debris recovered on Long Island were staged and distributed to selected newspapers. Reporters were told these photos depicted equipment seized during raids, though most had been recovered months earlier. The optics worked. Each new article reinforced a reassuring rhythm. The government was alert, its methods infallible, its justice decisive. For civilians, the narrative became a lesson in obedience. Fall in line, stay vigilant, trust the Bureau. The notion that the saboteurs had been executed in a secret tribunal without jury oversight never entered mainstream awareness. When questions did emerge, mostly from legal scholars, the administration dismissed them as academic nitpicking. America was at war. Abstractions could wait for peace. In truth, peace never came for those inside the system that Hoover built. The Bureau's newfound prestige reshaped federal power permanently. Wartime censorship gave Hoover leverage over the press, which translated into post-war political immunity. He learned that controlling a story could be as effective as controlling evidence. And Operation Pastorius had been his greatest rehearsal. Propaganda also played abroad. The Office of War Information collaborated with the Bureau to translate the story into shortwave broadcasts aimed at Europe. The message was psychological. America cannot be touched. It reached occupied countries as a whisper of Allied competence and reached Germany as a warning of futility. Ironically, Canaris, whose Abwehr had organized the original mission, listened in measured silence. His agency's credibility had been shattered, his propaganda victory handed to the enemy by an American narrative machine. Meanwhile, George Dasch followed this spectacle from a prison cell. His name never appeared in the press. The man who had made the FBI's triumph possible became invisible. Each time Hoover stood before cameras, Dasch's erasure grew more complete. To those who knew, it felt cruelly symmetrical. Berlin would have shot him as a traitor. Washington buried him in bureaucracy. His act of betrayal had saved the nation and built a myth that excluded him entirely. By late 1942, magazines published celebratory retrospectives. Illustrations showed heroic agents capturing spies at gunpoint, though no shot had been fired in reality. Radio dramas exaggerated the suspense with ticking bombs and fire at factories that never burned. The myth became history long before historians could intervene. A Gallup poll that winter found public confidence in the FBI at unprecedented levels. Hoover's approval eclipsed even military generals. Americans believed their cities were secure because the Bureau had seen everything before it happened. The illusion was perfect, and illusions are powerful during war. From the vantage point of propaganda experts, it was textbook execution. Fear was manufactured, contained, and redeployed to strengthen state legitimacy. Every government during wartime sought that balance, control through reassurance. But the U.S. achieved it with cinematic precision, secrecy behind walls, heroism on paper. By the time newspapers moved on to headlines from Guadalcanal in North Africa, Operation Pastorius was no longer a current event. It had become a symbol, a patriotic parable told to unify a divided country. Few realized how much of it had been written by Hoover's publicists rather than investigators. What had begun as Germany's attempt to fracture American morale had been inverted into one of the most effective domestic propaganda campaigns of the war. And just beneath that triumphal surface lay an irony Hoover would never acknowledge. Germany had wanted fear to divide America. Instead, fear became the tool that bound it closer than ever to authority. The traitor who saved America. George John Dasch was still in his early 40s when the cell door clanged shut behind him at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. The summer heat pressed through the walls, thick and oppressive, a reminder that beyond him the war he tried to prevent still raged. He had no trial transcripts, no visitors, and no clarity on when or if he'd ever be free. The United States called him a spy. Germany branded him a traitor, and he was left to sea. At first, Dasch expected gratitude to arrive in time. He wrote letters addressed to the White House, to the Justice Department, to JEdgarHoover himself. In each, he recounted everything he'd done, surrendering voluntarily, naming the Saboteurs, saving industrial plants and thousands of workers from destruction. "I have saved lives for your country," he wrote, "but all I ask is to live mine here." The letters were polite, hopeful, 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 hope. When prison guards delivered his mail, the envelope stamped "Return Undeliverable," he slid them under his cot and stopped writing. Ernest Berger, imprisoned beside him, fared little better. The two men who had cooperated most completely were now the most isolated. To the guards, they were the Germans who talked. Fellow inmates avoided them, suspecting they might still be spies planted as decoys. Among other prisoners, word spread that these were the Saboteurs from Washington, a phrase half spoken, half legend. Weeks turned into months, and Dasch's optimism curdled into disbelief. The Bureau had already ensured he would remain invisible. FBI memoranda classified him as useful but untrustworthy. Hoover forbade any favorable reference to his role, insisting that keeping him obscure preserved the deterrent value of the executions. The nation must see punishment, he told subordinates, not pardon. So the man who had made the Bureau's triumph possible was erased from public knowledge entirely. Not even his name surfaced in press briefings or Attorney General summaries. Dasch studied newspapers from the prison library, searching the margins for mention of his own case. The headlines were predictable: Allied victories in the Pacific, advances in North Africa, another triumph for American industry. In between stories, faint references occasionally appeared: Nazi saboteurs executed. The phrasing was vague, final, devoid of context. He was reading an obituary that carefully untold his part in preventing it. By 1944, his confinement blurred into routine. He taught himself English grammar from discarded bulletins, kept notes on other inmate stories, and replayed in his mind those 2 days that changed everything: the Long Island landing, the train ride to Washington, his confession. Some nights he convinced himself he'd done the right thing. Other nights he wondered whether betrayal could ever really be righteous when so many others had died because of it. In Germany, meanwhile, a darker silence formed. The 6 executed men were buried under numbers, but within Wehrmacht corridors, rumors spread. Some claimed Dasch had been tortured into confession. Others called him Verräter, traitor, a title that carried a fate worse than death. Goebbels' propaganda ministry quietly added his name to internal blacklists, ensuring he remained unmentionable in official accounts. When soldiers cursed the failure of Operation Pastorius, they did so by invoking him as the reason. The war's end in 1945 did nothing to clarify his fate. Behind Leavenworth's walls, victory sounded like distant applause for a show he wasn't allowed to see. He petitioned again for release, arguing that the mission's collapse had proven his loyalty to America. This time, his case reached a new occupant of the White House, Harry S. Truman. The president reviewed the summary: 2 collaborators imprisoned, 6 executed, case closed. No legal objection to clemency, one aide advised. Truman waited. It took 3 more years for that recommendation to turn into action. In the summer of 1948, a quiet executive order arrived at Leavenworth. Dasch and Berger were to be released and deported immediately to Germany in recognition of substantial cooperation. There was no ceremony, no apology. Guards handed them plain civilian suits and a sealed envelope containing one-way travel papers. The next day, they boarded a military transport aircraft bound for Frankfurt, leaving American soil as ghosts no one wanted to remember. The country they returned to was rubble. Post-war Germany was divided, hungry, suspicious. Both men were met not with curiosity, but hatred. In the devastated streets of Frankfurt, word spread quickly that 2 condemned saboteurs had come home alive. Crowds called them cowards who had doomed their cow home alive. Crowds called them cowards who had doomed their cow, and their cowards who had doomed their cow. The rencontre who had tutti to wally a height. Yet, who were on the devastated streets of Frankfurt, word spreads quickly that Telmherzi. To locals, they weren't heroes who spared America. They were men who'd shamed the fatherland. Dasch understood immediately he would never belong again. He settled in a small apartment in Ludwigshafen, taking odd clerical work under an assumed name. Friends were scarce. Once, he applied for a permit to return to the United States, arguing that his actions had served the American democracy. The request reached a mid-level State Department clerk, who noted tersely, subject not desirable. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of exile. Years passed. In 1959, Dasch scraped together savings to self-publish a memoir, 8 Spies Against America. The book was plain, factual, defensive. He chronicled every decision from the submarine's deck to the tribunal cell block. He didn't seek sympathy, only recognition that his betrayal had been moral, not opportunistic. The few American reviewers who read it called the account self-serving. German printers quietly dropped future editions after nationalist groups threatened boycotts. The pages vanished as swiftly as the man himself. His companion, Berger, died not long after, bitter but unrepentant. Dasch endured, surviving on small pensions and isolation. He corresponded with a handful of American journalists who rediscovered the case in the 196s, sending them photocopies of the letters he once wrote to Roosevelt. "You cannot imagine," he wrote, "what it is like to be hated by both sides for saving them from each other." Neighbors remembered him as quiet, polite, perpetually cautious. He avoided politics, avoided crowds, avoided the war museums that reopened across West Germany. When asked about the past, he often replied that the past asks too many questions. In 1976, a minor documentary misrepresented him as a coward who had defected for self-preservation. He watched it once, turned off the television, and never spoke publicly again. By the 198th, his life had shrunk to routine. Groceries, walks along the Rhine, occasional letters from distant American historians seeking comment. He rarely answered. When one journalist visited in 1989, she found him living alone among yellowing newspapers and an aging typewriter still loaded with ribbon. On the wall above his desk hung a faded clipping, "FBI foils Nazi sabotage plot." The headline that should have been his vindication had become a cruel reminder. He told her, "I am the only man who ever tried to sabotage Hitler by betraying him, and the world forgot within a week." 2 years later, in 1991, George John Dasch died quietly in that same apartment at the age of 89. His death certificate listed no profession, no distinction, no cause beyond natural. The town newspaper ran a brief free for The town newspaper ran a brief free. There was no connection drawn to Operation Pastorius or the secret trial that had followed. His remains were cremated without ceremony. In the end, history left him exactly where politics had placed him, invisible between two nations that used his story for convenience and then erased it for comfort. To America, he was a necessary embarrassment. To Germany, an unforgivable traitor. Yet the record, buried in declassified files, tells something simpler. Without Dasch, the FBI would never have known what approached its shores that June night. Without him, factories might have burned, bridges collapsed, and civilians died in chaos. He saved lives and lost his own country in the process. The man condemned by both sides lived and died, proving that doing the right thing in war doesn't always mean winning peace afterward. Secrets that reshape justice. When Operation Pastorius collapsed, America celebrated. The FBI had saved the homeland, Roosevelt had acted decisively, and the press treated the story as closed. But beneath that closure, something more enduring took root. The case had fused secrecy and justice into a single mechanism, one that would quietly reshape American power for generations. It began almost immediately after the trial. The files, transcripts, and correspondence were sealed under federal order. Only a small circle of military officers and Justice Department lawyers knew the full details. There had never been a domestic military tribunal of such scale, and even within the government, few understood what precedent had just been set. Staff attorneys filed reports noting the institutional potential of military justice for internal security. Those words didn't sound ominous at the time, they sounded practical. America was still on alert, and efficiency was the new virtue. Inside the FBI, Hoover used the victory to expand authority. He argued before Congress that the sabotage case exposed gaps in domestic intelligence coverage and demanded broader surveillance powers. Legislators, caught between fear and patriotism, agreed without question. Within months, the Bureau doubled its counterintelligence funding. New internal divisions appeared, security index teams cataloging the names of suspect nationals, programs coordinated with postal inspectors and radio monitors. The ghosts of the German saboteurs justified it all. For Americans alive in 1943, these changes were invisible. On paper, the agency's mission looked unchanged: protect the homeland. But internally, defensive vigilance was turning into active investigation. Before Pastorius, the Bureau's reach ended at criminal suspicion. After Pastorius, it extended to potential intent. Anyone who might be capable of sabotage could be watched, questioned, recorded. Hoover quoted Roosevelt's Tribunal directive in private memos: prevent before act, punish without hesitation. It became the Bureau's creed. Meanwhile, policy planners in Washington studied the military tribunal structure. The machinery had operated with remarkable speed, unimpeded by public scrutiny. Legal historians later discovered memoranda circulated through the War Department titled Model for Future Wartime Justice. These templates outline procedures for detaining foreign agents at the discretion of executive authority, echoing the language used to condemn the saboteurs. The convenience was irresistible. The next time an espionage case appeared, the blueprint already existed. In a sense, Operation Pastorius was never just a trial, it was an experiment. The results were double-edged. On one side, Americans gained reassurance that their government could act swiftly against internal threats. On the other, constitutional tradition absorbed a quiet alteration. The Supreme Court's decision in Ex Parte Quirin had codified the exception. Certain enemies deemed unlawful stood outside civic protection. Once written, that exception could be invoked again. Biddle sensed the danger. In a letter penned but never sent to Roosevelt, he wrote, "We have proved our strength. Now we must prove our restraint." He understood that emergency powers, once exercised successfully, are rarely relinquished. Hoover, by contrast, saw permanence in progress. For him, Pastorius validated the fusion of law enforcement intelligence, two functions that had long been kept separate. By 1944, the FBI had become a hybrid force, part police, part spy agency, operating inside its own country with minimal oversight. The strategy worked. Despite scattered criticism from civil libertarians, congressional committees praised the Bureau's preemptive vigilance. Every intercepted letter, every arrested suspect could be traced, rhetorically, to the legacy of the Nazi saboteurs. Each new arrest proved that Hoover's paranoia kept America safe. It was circular logic, and it was effective. Across the Atlantic, Germany took note for a different reason. The Abwehr's implosion after Pastorius reinforced Hitler's suspicion of covert operations. Canaris soon faced dismissal and later execution for treason. Ironically, the same sabotage failure that empowered American security mechanisms helped disintegrate Germany's own. The secret war had created asymmetry. Openness weakened, secrecy empowered. But perhaps the most unintended consequence unfolded quietly in 1942's aftermath, the creation of the Office of Strategic Services. Roosevelt authorized it as America's wartime intelligence body, a direct response to fears of infiltration. Though the OSS focused abroad, its architects referenced Pastorius repeatedly in justification memos. Hostile ingress upon U.S. soil demonstrates necessity for unified intelligence coordination. In bureaucratic language, that meant permanent espionage capability. After the war, the OSS transformed into the Central Intelligence Agency. Its founding logic traced back to a failed beach landing in Amagansett. For Hoover, this evolution was both validation and threat. The Bureau would not lose domestic primacy without a fight. He built alliances with military intelligence officers, trading files and sometimes withholding them to preserve leverage. The country's emerging intelligence infrastructure took shape in rivalry and secrecy, an echo of the very paranoia Operation Pastorius was meant to cure. Each agency learned the same lesson: the first to control the narrative controlled the power. Over the years, secrecy metastasized into policy habit. Government transparency narrowed behind war necessity, later behind Cold War loyalty. Every classified decision carried a lineage back to 1942, the idea that some truths must remain hidden to protect national confidence. The public accepted this bargain unconsciously. The nation had survived the saboteurs. Secrecy now signified safety. In university law courses, students debated Quirin as theoretical precedent. Few realized how practically it functioned. During the Korean War, military lawyers cited it to justify tribunals against captured spies. During Vietnam, internal memos resurfaced it when addressing anti-war activists suspected of foreign collusion. Each time, the context changed, but the foundation remained identical. Wartime necessity superseded normal justice. The legacy of 8 saboteurs extended far beyond their graves. Even with judiciary, quiet discomfort persisted. In 1948, Justice William O. Douglas wrote an essay hinting at regret. We nodded to expedience and called it victory. The essay never mentioned Pastorius directly, but every reader recognized the reference. By then, Dasch had been deported to Germany, living unseen among ruins, while the doctrine his trial produced shaped the post-war world. The larger paradox became clear only decades later. The United States had treated secrecy as protection, but secrecy itself became self-replicating. The FBI's domestic counterintelligence network evolved into what later generations would call the security state, a machine running on the fuel of fear. The OSS morphed into the CIA, exporting covert action abroad, importing its rationale from the tribunal's silence. Every decision bore the same imprint: efficiency over transparency, order over openness. No one designed it consciously. The transformation happened the way erosion happens, slow, unseen, until a coastline looks unfamiliar. By the time scholars revisited Operation Pastorius in the 196s, its significance had inverted. What once looked like a story of 8 doomed men now appeared as a starting point for America's modern intelligence era. Archival researchers traced memos from 1942 linking the Saboteur case to new surveillance directives. One note from a wartime committee chair summarized the sentiment frankly: public fear is the most renewable resource in government. The phrase reads cynical now, but it captured the logic that held through future decades, from the Red Scare to the War on Terror. Each crisis reopened the same precedent: extraordinary measures in extraordinary times. The public seldom asked when those times would end. Back on Long Island, the beach at Amagansett returned to quiet anonymity. The dunes reclaimed the buried crates, saw their erasing footprints no historian could find. Yet under that sand lay more than rusted metal. It was history's hinge point, where the line between justice and control blurred under moonlight. Operation Pastorius hadn't destroyed America's infrastructure. It had altered its constitutional landscape. Every sealed courtroom, every classified memorandum, every unnamed detention owes a fragment of its existence to that moment. 8 men came ashore intending to cripple America's war machine. Only one betrayed them, and only one question survived them. What does a democracy become when it learns to keep its own secrets too well? The hidden legacy. The Atlantic wind still combs over the dunes at Amagansett, the same stretch of coast where the story began. The sand has swallowed the outlines of that midnight landing. No trace of crates, no footprints, just wind and salt. Beneath that quiet lies the ghost of a world caught between law and law, and the ghost of a world caught between law and not law. And beneath that quiet lies the ghost of a world caught between law and gum tiritagna. And the eye lies the ghost of a world caught between law and Zayn law. Operation Pastorius ended in 2 days, yet its shadow lingered far longer than the tide that washed away its evidence. Every artifact left behind told a fragment of the larger paradox: the explosives buried for destruction that never came, the bribe money used to silence a Coast Guardsman, and the paper trails that led to the highest court in the land. Government archivists cataloged the items for decades: rusted detonators, damp uniforms, unspent bills, each stored under the label Sabotage, 1942. The remains became curiosities, not reminders. The larger consequences couldn't be shelved so easily. From a legal standpoint, the operation ended with closure. Verdicts signed, appeals. Denied, records sealed. But secrecy resists endings. The files stayed classified for years, not to protect national security, but to protect narrative control. When historians later opened them, they found meticulous order, written summaries with trial meant to appear flawless. Yet between the carbon copies and affidavits, faint pencil notes told another story: uncertainty dressed up as certainty. Justice wrapped in performance. By the 195s, America's wartime confidence had hardened into Cold War vigilance. The machinery that had silenced 8 saboteurs outlived the crisis that justified it. Where once the enemy was Germany, now it was ideology itself. Hoover's bureau carried its authority forward, invoking the same logic that secured Roosevelt's tribunal. Surveillance widened to include political groups, activists, entire communities. The techniques of emergency justice became administrative habit. Every telephone tap and loyalty hearing carried the echo of Dasch's forgotten confession. Meanwhile, the war's physical traces faded. The Long Island dunes were reshaped by storms and development. Locals built cottages above the old landing site, unaware of the history below their foundations. In time, even the Coast Guard patrol routes changed, and the small outpost that once spotted the saboteurs was decommissioned. When environmental historians rediscovered the location in the 197s, they found scraps of fuses tangled in dune grass, corroded metal that no museum would display. The past had returned to raw elements: iron, salt, silence. But memory doesn't always decay with matter. Veterans of the FBI's wartime service wrote memoirs in the late 196s describing the case with patriotic polish. They portrayed the tribunal as decisive, clean, morally unambiguous. None mentioned the classified transcripts or Biddle's private misgivings. The retellings became national folklore, the efficient republic standing firm against tyranny. The irony ran deeper than most readers knew. The same secrecy that protected the trial from criticism also insulated the myth from truth. When journalists revisited the court records decades later, they saw hints of a more complicated legacy. Some of the Saboteurs' testimonies were truncated in the official files, their translated statements replaced with summaries from military clerks. Dasch's plea letters appeared only in marginal Dasch's plea letters appeared only in marginal anodyne, and Elizabeth's plea letters appeared only in marginal analysis. The system had recorded everything except doubt. That absence became its defining archive. In Germany, Operation Pastorius remained an embarrassment few wanted to discuss. It symbolized not courage but incompetence. Yet even there, an unspoken fascination lingered, the idea that 8 men had briefly carried their war across an ocean, that one of them had turned conscience into weapon. For post-war generations, the episode felt like moral theater on foreign soil, a story of betrayal that refused tidy moral accounting. Standing on the beach today, the distance between then and now feels measured less in time than in questions still lingering. How much secrecy does justice need to survive fear? How much truth can a democracy hide before it starts erasing itself? Those questions were born in the calm after a botched landing, whispered in tribunal corridors, and written into law by men who promised the exception would never repeat. Yet, history shows exceptions rarely stay exceptional. The explosives once buried at Amagansett corroded into fragments, but the precedent forged in their shadow didn't rust. It lives in the legal citations of modern conflicts, in debates about enemy combatants and national security, in the reflex to seal inconvenient truths behind classification stamps. Each time America justifies silence in the name of safety, it unknowingly revisits that beach. For George John Dasch, the irony would have been unbearable. He prevented destruction, yet his act birthed the mechanisms that normalized secrecy as virtue. Both Berlin and Washington turned the same failure into propaganda. The Reich erased it for shame. The United States revised it for pride. Between those two silences stretched a real story, not one of bombs, but of how democracies learned to keep secrets from themselves. The dunes remain restless and shifting as history's quiet accomplices. Beneath them lies no treasure, only residue, evidence of a moment when 8 men tried to sabotage a nation and, through an act of betrayal, taught it how to hide its own truths. The waves erase each footprint, but the legacy stays written in policy and precedent, invisible yet permanent. The wreckage of Operation Pastorius wasn't measured in explosions or smoke. It existed in paper, orders signed in secrecy, verdicts typed behind locked doors, laws rewritten to fit fear's new shape. What began as a failed Nazi invasion dissolved into something quieter and longer lasting, a story about how democracies protect themselves by narrowing what they tell their own people. The 8 saboteurs never touched a single bridge or factory. Yet their brief presence forced America to test the boundaries of its justice, and the result was permanent. Roosevelt's tribunal proved that constitutional lines could bend without breaking, or so it seemed. The Supreme Court confirmed that fiction, calling it lawful necessity. And from that moment the precedent lived on, summoned whenever another war demanded quick judgment in darkness. Courts would later cite the case when deciding how to treat captured enemies in jungles, deserts, and detention camps that didn't yet exist. The names changed, the logic endured. Publicly, Operation Pastorius was a closed chapter. The tale of Nazi spies stopped in their tracks. Privately, it was a blueprint for future secrecy. Agencies discovered that information, handled carefully, could shape morale as effectively as any victory. But shape morale as effectively as any victory asti. Privately, Operation Pastorius. Hoover's FBI learned how narrative could build authority. Presidents learned how silence could stabilize uncertainty. The machinery of modern intelligence, the idea that some truths must remain hidden for safety's sake, traces its engineering back to that 1942 tribunal. For George John Dasch, the moral lesson was more personal. He exposed a plot and expected redemption. Instead, he watched both countries define him through convenience. Germany called him a traitor. America forgot him. His lone act of conscience saved lives, but proved expendable in history's accounting. It's tempting to view him as tragic, but his fate mirrored the principle his trial embodied: service measured not by fairness, but by usefulness. Once the usefulness was gone, so was recognition. 80 years later, the words written around his case still echo whenever governments confront unseen enemies. Unlawful combatant, extraordinary authority, necessary secrecy. Each phrase sounds temporary, emergency only. Each becomes permanent through repetition. The logic feels practical in its moment, then impossible to reverse. That's how war rearranged his law, one exception at a time. Operation Pastorius collapsed within 48 hours, but its afterlife shaped generations. It redefined the edge between justice and vengeance, between protecting liberty and suspending it. The 6 executed men became shadows and war statistics. The 2 survivors lived long enough to see their story rewritten without them. And the democracy that judged them emerged stronger in appearance, more guarded in instinct. The trial was secret. The consequences were not. From the dunes of Long Island to the corridors of government, one idea tied everything together: that fear, properly managed, keeps nations safe. Yet fear rarely retires once it's employed. It simply changes uniform and title. Every classified tribunal that followed owed something to the silence sealed inside that Washington basement. History remembers the failure of the plot. It rarely remembers the secrecy that followed it. The irony is hard to miss. A mission built to divide America instead taught it how to centralize power through quiet confidence. Betrayal suppressed enemy sabotage, but cultivated a subtler form of control. That's the legacy of Operation Pastorius: an empty beach, a sealed courtroom, and a precedent that still murmurs whenever wartime urgency meets the promise of constitutional restraint. If you want to see how that precedent echoes into today's hidden wars and intelligence debates, watch the next investigation. Subscribe for more untold chapters where courage, secrecy, and power collide just beneath the surface.